Why has anti-Asian racism resurfaced? For me, it has never gone away. As a Musqueam elder of Chinese and Musqueam ancestry, I experience this every day of my life. When you take into consideration all of the acts of denial perpetrated by the Canadian government against the Indigenous peoples, many of those acts have been used against the Chinese and the Asian peoples and other peoples around the world. Act now to stop anti-Asian racism.
Where are you really from? That is a question I've been asked my whole life. Once when I was traveling, someone asked me where I was from. I said Canada. And then he was like, but you don't. And he legit did this. At the time was like, ugh, again? It makes me feel like I don't belong in the country I was born and that it's supposed to only look this one way. Take the time to learn.
Boy, can I relate to that. I'm sure many of us joining here today have had that very same experience. Well, good morning and welcome to the first panel of the day. My name is Sophie Louie, and I'm very happy to be with you here today to moderate a discussion on why we are here, surfacing the impacts of anti-Asian racism. Now, before we begin, I would like to acknowledge that I'm speaking to you today from Vancouver, from the unceded territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh nations. And of course, you are all joining us from many places, near and far. And I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners and caretakers of those lands. If you would like to find out more about the land that you are on, there is a great resource for that. It's a website, native-land.ca. native-land.ca. So we hear these land acknowledgements a lot these days, and I don't want them to be just performative, just words on paper or words in a script. I hope that you spend time to, even though I am speaking from a script right now, but I want to make sure I get these words right. I hope that you do spend time to think about the people who were here for thousands and thousands of years before Canada became Canada, especially in light of the 215 children found in those unmarked graves at the former Kamloops Residential School. I hope it compels you to start to or continue to learn the history that's not being taught in schools, or at least wasn't when I was going to school. And I hope it helps you to unlearn some deeply rooted beliefs and notions that have brought us to where we are today. I would also like to take a moment to pay respect to the Afzal family of London, Ontario. Salman, Madiha, Yamna, and Salman's mother, killed in what police say was a premeditated attack, targeted only because of their Muslim faith. Thoughts and prayers, as we know, are not enough. They're never enough. But for what it's worth, my thoughts are with 9-year-old Fayez right now as he recovers from his injuries. I hope the love and support being shown from across this country will help to ease his grief and give him just a tiny bit of comfort in the days ahead. As I said, my name is Sophie. I'm from Global BC News, and I'll be your moderator today. This has been a year, to say the least. And I say a year because even though it's 2021, it just sort of feels like 2020 just won't stop. At best, it's been uncomfortable. At worst, it's been heartbreaking. And throughout, it has been so revealing the inequities that have always been there, but are brought into such sharp focus right now because of the COVID crisis. Revealing racism that has always been there, but is now rising and rampant and increasingly violent. We know anti-Asian racism isn't new, but there has been an historic rise in reported cases of anti-Asian hate and violence. The time to act is now. And that's why we're here today. Creating these spaces for us to share our experiences and having these hard conversations is critical for change to happen. Coming together as a city, as a province, as a country sends a powerful message of unity and drives home the urgent need for action and transformation. We need to go beyond the thoughts and find a way to take action. Now, for the Q&A portion of this event, we will be using an online audience engagement tool called Slido. You should have information about it, but you can start submitting your questions now to Slido and throughout the conversation. You will also be able to start voting on all the submitted questions. So questions with the most likes will go to the top of the list. I have the list right here on one of my many devices, and it's sort of like a popularity contest. So start liking the questions, and the ones at the top of the list are the ones I will likely go with. Now, just before we get to our panel, I also want to recognize the emotional toll these conversations can have on those who are directly involved in the discussions and those of you who are listening. Sometimes you just need to take a break, you need to step back, you need to mentally and spiritually regroup. So I'd ask that you please keep tabs on yourself and take a break if you feel the need. There is a list of well-being resources in the Feed Loop lobby for you, so feel free to just take a moment for yourself. All right, enough from me. It's now my pleasure to introduce you to our guests. First of all, Dr. Kenneth Fung is joining us today from Ontario. He's a staff psychiatrist and clinical director of the Asian Initiative in Mental Health program at Toronto Western Hospital, University Health Network, and associate professor with the Department of Psychiatry at the University of Toronto. Amy Go is a social worker by training. She is past president of the Chinese Canadian National Council, was one of the founders of Care Centre for Internationally Educated Nurses in Ontario, and she was on the boards of the National Action Committee on the Status of Women and the National Organization of Immigrant and Visible Minority Women. Ellen is a co-founder and community organizer with Project 1907. That's a group of volunteer community organizers aiming to elevate Asian voices that are underrepresented and undervalued in mainstream political, social, and cultural discourse, including amplifying the voices of women. And Olivia Lim is the co-lead for the Student Advisory Committee for the National Forum on Anti-Asian Racism. Olivia recently completed her BA in Honors English with a minor in Asian Canadian and Asian Migration Studies at UBC. Congratulations, Olivia. And thank you all to all of our panelists for being with us today. So let's start with just some initial thoughts from each of our panelists. I will start with Dr. Fung. Kenneth, go ahead.
Thank you so much, and thanks so much for the organizers for this wonderful national forum. And I'm so grateful to be here, to be able to participate in this important dialogue. And for me as a psychiatrist, I think it's very important that we have this dialogue about discrimination and racism and its impact on mental health. And because there's no health unless there's mental health, so we know that maintaining our well-being, both physically, mentally, it's all connected and it's important. And racism in all its forms, whether it's overt racism and physical attacks or covert racism and microaggressions, they are all important. And they all have a very negative impact on our mental health and well-being. So in this dialogue, I think for me, I think one of the most important things is to emphasize on the felt experience of racism. We know that some of the more obvious physical attacks can be highly traumatic in nature, but we know even from research that covert racism hurts just as much. And if we take a step back, I think psychologically, and we hear from even the sharing that we've heard from the video in the beginning, is that it psychologically can undermine our identity of who we are, your sense of belonging, and a sense of being in a fair society, resulting in many different kinds of emotion, from anxiety to insecurity to anger to powerlessness, depending on the individual. And we also further know that racism in its different forms, because it can be in the individual level and it can be in the systemic level, that it can really impact on what we call the social determinants of health, from housing to education, to all of the major institutions. And that impacts on, again, our physical and mental well-being in very many ways that sometimes are invisible unless we are really critically looking at the disparities. And part of, I think, the fact that that this hasn't been a national conversation frequently in many people's minds, except for, I think, a lot of people who champion for it, like the excellent work of Amy Goh all the time, we know, is that there's a lot of denial and minimization and discomfort around this topic that we need to acknowledge. And I think there are many reasons for that, psychologically and culturally. And this includes the concept of the myth of model minority, which we know is a myth. And there are also various cultural forces, from the Canadian culture of politeness and political correctness to the Asian culture of collectivistic and wanting to maintain harmony, to the individual psychological need, again, to live in a stable world, because no one wants to feel like they are always living in a war zone. It results in discomfort in this area. And I think it's okay to acknowledge that it is there, that there's denial, there's minimization, there's discomfort. And in response, there's also visibly or invisibly, there's an implicit bias. And there's also what we call internalized racism, meaning that even when we talk, even this morning, I talked to some of my Asian patients, they might say, oh, maybe more or less we kind of deserve it in the different roundabout kind of way. So I think that it's so important that we shed light on this racism in all its forms, looking carefully at how it impacts on all the different aspects of our lives. And I'm so glad that we have all these different sectors and opportunities. And of course, as a psychiatrist, I would advocate for us to approach this topic, even though there's a lot of high emotion of what we call righteous and justified, anger and frustration and anxiety, that we also bring a sense of mindfulness and compassion to ourselves and to each other. Because, as Sophie's saying, sometimes participating in this conversation, of course, is informative, it's empowering, and it helps us to move forward. At the same time, for some of us, it can also bring up a lot of painful emotions. Compassion and taking care of ourselves is important, and extending this compassion for others is also important, because we are here all together to decrease hate, so we can cultivate a sense of open, critical, reflective stand, looking at these issues without avoidance, yet still guided by our values of compassion, so that we can move forward collectively and increase our collective resilience together. And in our own spheres of influence, you all have your spheres of influence. The young people have a completely amazing social media kind of influence that I would never have, even though I'm still quite young the last time I checked. But there we are. We are hoping to move this collective dialogue together. So thank you for having me, and I look forward to our discussion.
Okay, great. Thank you so much, Kenneth. We are starting to get questions in on Slido, so that's great. Keep putting your questions in and voting on them. And we will get to those in just a few minutes. But let's go to our next panelist now for her initial thoughts. Amy.
Thank you so much for this opportunity. I want to echo what Kenneth said. We in Toronto really are very thankful for this opportunity to connect with your colleagues in BC and around the nation to speak about this very important issue. So I'm speaking on behalf of Chinese Canadian National Council for Social Justice. Actually, on January 28, 2020, we hosted our first press conference at the City of Toronto to denounce racism and stigmatization against Chinese Canadians, because the first case of COVID was found in Canada. However, we did not anticipate that not only Chinese, but also Asians or people that look Asian would be subjected to such violence in the last 15 months, and we still do. The pandemic definitely has shown the true colors of Canada, as Shirley and Kenneth have said. It has really shown the great disparities in our society experienced by racialized and other marginalized communities. And the long-term impact of such disparities would be grave and severe. And unfortunately, the most marginalized amongst us, including migrant workers, people without status from Asia and other countries, Asian Canadian women living in poverty, and those working in precarious jobs will suffer the most and the longest. So Chinese Canadian National Council for Social Justice, we launched a FaceRace campaign with our partner organizations with the funding support from Heritage Canada that aims at documenting the lived experiences of being Asian throughout this pandemic. It is a story of pain, humiliation, but also strength and resilience, as demonstrated by individuals, as well as collective community actions to call out and combat racism. FaceRace campaign also provides resources to address racist incidents and tools for parents to engage in anti-racism discussions. Just the other day, an educator in Toronto reached out and thanked CCNC-SJ for those marvelous tools that she is actually using in her own class for children and for students. So after calling out against anti-Asian racism, demanding Black Lives Matter, idle no more, and denouncing Islamophobia, are Canadians really ready to face race and racism? CCNC-SJ in the last year, because of our hashtag FaceRace campaign and others, we have received support from individuals and allies. And in fact, we were so heartened by the hundreds of individuals, mostly young Asian Canadians, who came out and say, when are we going to have a rally in response to the Atlanta massacre? So we organized a rally and over 6,000 people show up. So we are really encouraged by this show of solidarity and support from not only Asian Canadian community, but other racialized communities and also white communities. And at the same time, we have received attention from corporations, big and small, that wanted to do something, take actions, raise funds. We are glad. We are very glad that they reached out to us. And last month is Asian Heritage Month. And let me tell you, my colleagues and I at CCNC-SJ have never been so busy. We were speaking at different forums. We were invited by civil servants, schools, colleges, university, law firms, corporations, both here and the US, to engage in dialogues about anti-Asian racism. And where we talk about white supremacy, white privileges, and how the structural racism, colonization has perpetuated racism, oppression, and marginalization. So all of them came back to us and responded and politely complimented us for our presentation or our dialogue. Would they ever come back and invite us back? I don't know. More importantly, would they take actions to review their own structural inherent inequities, racism, and try to bring about change? I don't know. I hope so. So challenges that face CCNC-SJ and our partners right now are to ensure that anti-Asian racism is not just a flavor of the month issue. It's not just the moment, this momentary attention and focus by the government, the white society, and all our allies across sectors. We are seeing that Asian Canadians are more willing to speak up, and we are also more willing to speak up for Indigenous rights, against anti-Black racism, against Islamophobia. But are we really more willing to open our eyes to see the devastation of the intersectionality of race, gender identity, sexual orientation, and other forms of oppression. When we ask the white people to face race, are we also asking ourselves to face race, racism, and all its ramifications? As Kenneth said, within Asian Canadian communities, there's tremendous still amount of resistance to confront race, racism. Even if we are confronting race and racism, we seem to look at it as a one-dimensional issue. We do not see the intersectionality or its true impact on those that are most impacted by racism and different forms of oppression. When we are talking about recovery, we talk about Chinatown, we talk about businesses, but do we think about those migrant workers or those workers who have no status actually working in Chinatown, in those small businesses now? Do we think about the sex workers? Do we think about the massage parlor workers working in the communities? Recently in Toronto, we actually have community organizations have launched a campaign to get people vaccinated, because Chinatown, prior to this round of vaccination, has one of the lowest rate of vaccination in the city, in the province, in fact. And through Friends of Chinatown and other organizations, they have to dedicate so much attention and outreach to rally the community, to get them to get vaccinated, and more importantly, to address their fear of being disclosed because they don't have status, being exposed because they don't have status. So all these issues are critical when we are talking about racism. Racism has denied Asian Canadians our access. Racism has denied our full rights as citizens. Racism has denied many of us from advancement, but racism has also really marginalized those because of other forms of oppression will continue to be at the bottom of the rung. So please, my plea to all of us today is to think about facing race and the broader ramifications of race, not only within Asian Canadian communities, but beyond, and really show our solidarity across the spectrum. So thank you very much for this opportunity, and I look forward to our discussion.
Thank you very much, Amy. All right, we'll go to our next panelist, Ellen from Project 1907. Ellen?
Good morning, everyone. Yes, as mentioned, my name is Ellen. I'm a community organizer with Project 1907. I'll also echo thanks for the opportunity to take part today. And thank all of you who have joined us for making it a priority to be here and to be part of this conversation. So as mentioned, Project 1907 is a grassroots organization. We aim to elevate Asian voices. And one way we're doing that right now is by collecting and sharing reports of anti-Asian racism. So experiences of hate, violence, and racism experienced by the Asian diaspora in Canada. As Kenneth mentioned, there is denial and there is minimization of anti-Asian racism. So what we're trying to do is paint a picture of what anti-Asian racism looks like, what it feels like, who it impacts, what the impacts are, and to really say this is happening. This is a systemic problem and we cannot ignore it. So since 2020, over 1,500 incidents of anti-Asian racism have been reported to 2 reporting centers, Eliminate Hate, which we run in partnership with the Vancouver Asian Film Festival, and the Fight COVID Racism campaign, which we run with partners out east in Ontario, including the Chinese Canadian National Council Toronto chapter and the Chinese Canadian National Council for Social Justice.
I'm going to share a little bit more detailed analysis now. So I just want to preface this by saying, some of this might be a bit unpleasant to hear, particularly if you're a racialized person or if you identify as an Asian person. So I'll echo what Sophie said, and I ask that you take care of yourself first. So that might mean stepping away for a moment, or remembering to take a sip of water, whatever works for you. So per capita, Canada has more reported incidents than the United States by 100%. So it's not by a little, it's by a lot. And we know that Canada has an angel complex when it comes to racism. And we need to actively counter this narrative because it is simply untrue. When we look in more detail and we do breakdown by subnational region, we can see that British Columbia continues to have the most reported incidents per capita of any North American province, state, or territory. So British Columbia leads, followed by California, New York, Ontario, Washington, and Alberta. I love a quote by Denise Balkasoon. She says, "Endless surprise at evidence of its own racism is one of the most racist things about Canada." And I think those words ring so true and could not ring any truer today, not only in relation to anti-Asian racism, but as Amy mentioned, also in relation to all other forms of xenophobia, Islamophobia, anti-Indigenous racism, anti-Black racism. This surprise and ongoing shock that this is happening in our country needs to stop, and we need to move beyond this. In terms of impacts, we can see that women continue to be disproportionately impacted. They're reporting over 60% of all incidents, and the majority of those people are identifying as East Asian. We also know this is impacting Southeast Asian folks, mixed race folks, South Asian folks, Indigenous folks who are being mistaken for being Asian. So it's not only impacting East Asians, but that is the majority. And in terms of type of discrimination, we're seeing verbal harassment. So that includes threats, racial slurs, swearing, yelling. That's included in 67% of all reports. Also, alarmingly, assault is making up 1 in 4 incidents. So those are things like spitting, targeted coughing, or physical violence, pushing, shoving, physical attacks. I'll also show you a bit of a breakdown of the incidents by province. So if we take a look at the darker color, that is adjusting for population. So BC leads, followed by Ontario, Alberta, and Quebec. And if we look at it by city, Vancouver is reporting the highest number of incidents, followed by Toronto, Calgary, Montreal, and Ottawa. If we break that down further and take a look at where exactly these incidents are happening, we can see that 42% are taking place in public spaces. So streets, sidewalks, parks, places where, there might be witnesses and there might be bystanders. 15% of incidents are taking place in businesses, particularly food-related businesses, so grocery stores and restaurants. And this is where we really need to also look at what Amy was talking about, our frontline workers, our undocumented folks, who are the people that are working in these kinds of places. 7% of incidents are taking place online, 6% in private residences, 5% on public transit, and also in our schools and universities. And because we're here to talk about surfacing impacts, I also wanted to share a few quotes with you about how these incidents are impacting our Asian community members. I'll just read some of them here. "We are sacrificing our dignity and privacy by sharing with the world the hardships we're going through. I am very stressed and feeling depressed. My 5-year-old child is now terrified of going out and constantly asks if the police has caught the perpetrator. I do not feel safe in my own country. I have never felt such hatred being directed toward me. I have never been so humiliated in my life. I feel completely powerless and hopeless. I'm afraid to be living in my house, but to leave it as well. I was so shocked and in such pain that I had to stand and catch my breath for a few minutes. And I am overwhelmed with fear, anger, and sadness. So I'll leave that with you for now. I encourage us all to take a breath, and I look forward to further conversation. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Ellen. I feel like a lot of people who are with us today can probably relate to a lot of those feelings, those being overwhelmed with sadness and anger and all of these emotions that for me felt like they came out of nowhere. And even though I wasn't being directly impacted, just seeing these things happening and knowing they were happening, it brought that surprising emotion into me over this past year. All right, we'll go to our final panelist for her opening thoughts, Olivia Lim from UBC. Olivia?
Thank you for that introduction, Sophie. And my thanks to all the other speakers for sharing their insights with us here today. Speaking from my perspective as a student and from my involvement with the Asian Canadian and Asian Migration Studies program at UBC, I'm frequently reminded of the long history that anti-Asian racism has within our education systems and in Canada. Drawing on my own experiences, I would like to share my own reckoning with what it means to be an Asian Canadian student on campus and the impacts of anti-Asian racism in our current moment. To me, being Asian in educational spaces so often means having to fight to see ourselves, our communities, and stories represented in meaningful ways that allow for the complexity of our personhood. Higher education continues to be a fraught space in terms of anti-Asian racism. I think of moments in our history like the infamous Too Asian article published by Maclean's in 2010 that traded in model minority stereotypes to argue that Canadian universities were becoming overrun by Asian students. I think of the ways that Canadian universities failed to protect their Japanese students during internment in 1942, including the 76 students who were forcibly removed from UBC. And these violences stand among so many others. And captured in these particular histories is the violent surfacing of anti-Asian narratives like Yellow Peril that fester in the undercurrents of racism that flow throughout our education systems and broader society. This is the legacy of anti-Asian racism that maps onto our present, shaping the contours of the spaces we find ourselves in, manifesting in all the implicit and explicit indications that these institutions were never designed for us. It is being perceived as a monolith, told that you are overrepresented in higher education while struggling to find meaningful representation of yourself or your community in your learning. I think of the program I'm a part of, Asian Canadian and Asian Migration Studies, and the years of activism that went into lobbying for its existence. And I think of other campuses that do or don't have such spaces for their Asian communities, and what those struggles for visibility in the face of exclusion and dismissal mean. Institutions are happy to recognize us when we are model minority exemplars of achievement or success, smiling with our degrees and high GPAs. Less so when they realize that we are real people with needs and flaws, and when we try to surface the issues that matter to us or speak out about the injustices that we see. The impact of anti-Asian racism is hearing a remark made in class and counting all the times I've bit my tongue, swallowed back my words, and instead glanced across at the other Asian student in the room, seeing the expression of surprised unsurprise on my face mirrored in theirs. It manifests in needing to be an expert before we're qualified to speak about our own experiences, and when we do speak up, frustration around the ways we need to speak, the boxes we need to fit ourselves into in order to be heard. As we look ahead to returning to life in public post-pandemic, The impact of anti-Asian racism is worrying about the safety of yourself, your family, your friends, while knowing that there are members of your community that have already been facing the brunt of what it means to be Asian in public in 2021. But even as we are here all together in conversation about the impacts of anti-Asian racism, I want to do more than reiterate a litany of traumas. The truth is, we already know what the impacts of anti-Asian racism are. We've felt them. We've watched ourselves and our loved ones experience them, whether we are just coming to these realizations now or if we've been engaged in them for years. So I also want to think about impacts in terms of the galvanizing impulse that flows from our current moment, building on previous generations of activist labor, to consider the generative things that have happened in response to and in spite of the violence and pain of racism. I'm conscious of the work that is happening on campuses through community organizations and activism, and the work we're doing across all areas of life in whatever spaces we find ourselves in. So as we head into this forum, coming from different places in life, generations, locations, and forms of embodied experience, I want us to reckon with what it means to be having this conversation about anti-Asian racism at this time, on this land, together in this community. And as we carry that question with us and its many simultaneous answers, I think we will find possibility and responsibility, along with our commitments to ourselves, to each other, and our communities.
All right, thank you so much, Olivia. We do have lots of questions coming up on Slido, and I do want to get to them. But before we do, and we only have about 25 minutes left here, so I'll ask that you keep your answers to my questions brief, and then we'll get to Slido. But I want to know, because we've talked about how it's not an anti-Asian racism is not a new thing in Canada. It has obviously been increasing. We saw those stats from Ellen. It's been increasing since the pandemic began. But anti-Asian racism and racism in Canada is far from being a new thing. Knowing of the increase in incidents over the past year, how has your anti-racism, anti-Asian racism work changed over the past year, or has it? Maybe I'll start with you, Amy. You talked about it. You don't want this to become a flavor of the month kind of thing.
I think calling out racism is unfortunate because of all these incidents. We call out racism, it was easier. I still remember when I first started with CCNC at the end of 1980s, I had to engage in debate about why multiculturalism policy in Canada doesn't work. It is, hiding. It is actually a facade that hides the racism and discrimination and the reality of lived experiences of racialized people then. So of course, now that that these blatant and unabashed racist assaults and the violence has made that topic easier to be raised and to be discussed. I think that, to me, is, of course, better than before. However, because we are intrinsically and systematically trying to deal with white supremacy and the structural inherent, inequities, would that bringing this topic up mean that we can then dismantle that structural issue? I hope it's, again, a first step, but there's still so much that can be done to get there, because changing the power structure is very hard.
Okay, thank you, Amy. Maybe I'll go to Ellen next, because your group has really looked at the rise over the past year in incidents. You've got the hard numbers, but has it impacted how you approach your anti-racism work?
I have to agree with Amy in terms of experiencing a bit of an opening to have this conversation. So, even 2 years ago, we would stand up in rooms and say anti-Asian racism. And people would not even understand what those words meant. They couldn't even say it. And today, you know, fast forward a couple of years later, everyone, or it's like we're having a national dialogue on anti-Asian racism, right? So we've certainly moved forward. There's certainly an opening to have more of a conversation and to actually acknowledge that this is happening. And I think we cannot discount that. It's super, super important. And then I think the question for us, as Amy said, within our community is like, how will we do this work? And how will we do this work while ensuring that we're lifting everyone with us, but we're not perpetuating cycles of harm, learning about the biases that our communities hold, how we harm other people. Like, we need to look at all of those things. Really, we need self-reflexivity. And I think it's starting to happen. And I do see hope in that. So it's a starting point.
Yeah. I guess it's unfortunate that it takes what we've seen in the past year for us to now have this starting point and to have this opening, but here we are. Olivia, I'll ask you the same question. What has been the impact on your anti-racism work, considering what has unfolded over the past year?
Yeah, speaking to work that's going on campuses and universities, I think a lot of the work was we were already having conversations within our communities about this kind of thing. But just to echo what other speakers have said, just getting people to acknowledge that anti-Asian racism was a thing was an entirely different landscape a couple of years ago. Because there's always this perception of, oh, there are enough Asians at our universities where you've somehow reached this like critical mass where like racism isn't an issue for you. This idea that there can be somehow enough of us to like counterbalance the impacts of racism. So there's a lot of that rhetoric floating around. So now doors are opening. I think, like other speakers have pointed out, it's important to also remember what the cost was of those doors opening, what it took to get them to open, at the same time as we are very grateful and conscious of not losing the movement of this moment.
Mm-hmm. Okay, Kenneth, the mental health impact over this past year, I imagine it has been quite something to see from your perspective. Talk a bit about how this past year has unfolded from a psychiatric and mental health perspective. Oh, Kenneth, you're muted.
Okay.
Gotcha.
Silence no more. Silence no more. So, yeah, I think that certainly with the pandemic, it has highlighted a number of ongoing issues. Racism is one of them, but mental health needs is another. So in mental health, I am especially interested in cultural psychiatry, the intersection of social and cultural issues in mental health. And mental health is another issue where there is a lot of stigma around it. And very, very similar story to racism we're talking about. Usually there's a critical incident and people, care about mental health because there's a suicide, there's a violence. And then, after the media dies down, then, people try to not talk about mental health as much as possible. Similarly, racism, right? When there's a critical event, everyone is outraged, and then the media don't cover it anymore because it's moved on to the next thing. So I think that, and then there's the intersection of both, as we talked about, how racism fundamentally attacks the mental health well-being, both individually, the hurt that people have experienced. Like I have a woman in the pandemic, going to shopping, she doesn't know in the early phases to wear a mask and not to wear a mask, because when she wears a mask, she felt the racism and attacks. And when she doesn't wear a mask, she doesn't feel right. She wants to help the community. And there was another woman who was like shopping in line. And when there was a racist remark, she bolted through the door. She couldn't handle it. And then she berated herself, feeling guilty. Why did I just leave the shopping cart at the door? Why couldn't I have stood up for myself? And then, start feeling guilty about how she didn't stand up for herself, but also terrorized at the same time. So we hear every day the impacts of it. I think that both in terms of mental health and well-being and racism, these are intersecting issues, as Amy talked about. And we need to kind of pay attention to both, not only for the flavor of the moment, but really look at it in an ongoing kind of way. And racism occurs in a systemic way in that we know that the Chinese and Asian Canadians, again, if I say what research studies have shown, just like Alan has shown, it shocks people. Like, people just don't think that, let's say, Chinese Canadians have any mental health needs. Because we know historically, in any mental health care program, it doesn't matter if it's for adults or in schools, they always say that Chinese people don't have any mental health needs. So we look at all the foreign students in university levels, but you look at the actual mental health wellness, who access them? It's not the Asians, and so there is a disconnect here. There's a systemic inequity here, even in healthcare services. And then if we look at actual stats, again, if we break down by groups, similarly shocking graphs. If you look at the self-rated mental health, Chinese is actually worse than Asians, worse than Blacks, worse than white Canadians in a study. And again, people would not believe it. They think, oh, because of the myth of the model minority, they don't have mental health needs. So certainly, I think in this pandemic, we need to, it's an opportunity to pay attention to both and how we can decrease and eliminate racism in all its forms, including the systemic racism.
Right, okay. My therapist would very much disagree that Chinese Canadians don't need mental health help.
Exactly.
All right.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And this is just from me listening to you.
Thank you. All right, let's get to some of our Slido questions. I'm just going to go in the order of popularity here. So our first Slido question is from Young Joe. And the question is, how shall we manage microaggressions of anti-Asian behavior that people with limited English proficiency face every day in healthcare and justice? And probably even just, going shopping. You see it all the time. So how do we deal with that? Someone who doesn't have great English, but they get treated differently because of it. Who would want to tackle that? I'm pointing at all of you. Ellen, how about you?
How shall we manage microaggressions of anti-Asian behavior that people with limited English proficiency face every day in healthcare and justice systems? I mean, I think when we're looking at microaggressions, we need, when we talk, I think we need to be speaking of systemic racism. So there's lots of, management strategies or coping mechanisms that we could encourage people to take. But I think this puts the responsibility on individuals when the responsibility needs to be on systems. So when we're talking about our healthcare system, who are our healthcare workers? What are their language proficiencies? What are the barriers to getting into healthcare professions? I think these are the types of things we need to be looking at in order to create more of a systemic, lasting change. And I think the same for the justice system. And it's interesting when you look at the history of anti-Asian racism in Canada, and particularly in BC, and we know that Asian people were excluded from certain professions, including professions in healthcare and law. So what are the impacts of that today? Those are the kinds of questions I think that we should be thinking about, and that we need to address in order to create more of a systemic change.
Amy and Kenneth have their hands up. Okay, I'll go with Amy first because she got her hand up faster.
Yeah, totally agree with Ellen. I think the responsibility lies with the institutions, right? And if these microaggressions happen in, be it a public space, but privately owned, right? Could be in even in the supermarket, grocery stores, or of course in healthcare settings. The responsibility would lie with those who are running those services and running those businesses. How do you ensure that your customers, your consumers, your patients, your clients receive the most equitable and respectful services? And I would think that it is important to call out all these workplaces, all these service providers, to ensure that they have procedures in place, their policies, they have training, they have, of course, inclusive, equitable hiring practices and all that, to make sure that it's not a poisoned, it's not a dangerous or unsafe environment. These days, as a consultant, I'm hearing a lot of that in workplaces, and it's unfortunate that workplaces, including our healthcare system, have not been able to provide safe places. As the study that's done by Ellen and the others in CCNC-Toronto, we have quotes from nurses saying that they, in the workplace, the encountering of that aggression, it's devastating. And I think it is important for us to point that out. And of course, in the justice system, in the policing system, we all know the law enforcement system is completely, of course, permeated by racism. And I think those institutions, the policymakers and decision makers, have a responsibility to address those, and not the responsibility should not be on Asian Canadians or the individuals who receive those services.
Kenneth, obviously you're in the healthcare system. What are your thoughts on this?
I think this is such a crucial, important question, because I run a clinic for Asians, and especially I deal with people who don't speak the language or speak the language with an accent. We all know about the power of accents. When I say the power or the disempowering effect of having accents. I think several things. I think number one is from the question, it talks about microaggression. So first of all, I think microaggression, we have to, again, keep in mind that it's as harmful as any kind of other forms of aggression. So we have to keep that in mind, because it really undermines people. Sometimes when we say microaggression, we also, in our minds or people's minds, that means it's only a little hurt, but it isn't. It's just devastating. And in these cases of language, we're talking about major barriers. And so I think this is reflected in what I said earlier, that when they really look at numbers, Chinese Canadians, for example, have least in terms of self-rated mental health, like the least, but also least in terms of sense of belonging to the country. So all these are interrelated with the language. As well, they have the lowest actual diagnosis from a healthcare provider because of the lack of access. So I see every day that people who don't speak the language well have problems accessing healthcare services or dismissed. This is both in physical and mental health, even in my own family. Even when my grandmother was admitted to the hospital for heart problems, she never gets anything explained to her. And so that's a huge barrier. And health and social justice. I mean, I'm not a lawyer, but unfortunately, I see enough of legal cases, whether it's because the person suffers from discrimination at work, or because of even like fighting for a car accident for your rights, but if you don't speak the language, or having any kind of mental health issues, and then people challenge you about parenting. So this reminds you of course, what happens to the indigenous population. And I actually have been involved in a number of cases where people's mental health are questioned, even their parenting. I have a child psychiatrist who talked to me. Well, obviously, this is not good parenting when the father doesn't immediately hug the daughter in supervised visits. And we're thinking, let's have you talk to our Asian parents, how, the different forms of parenting. So this access to language and culture, it's important, because we know that language is also culture and identity. And when we are starting to have denigrate certain kind of languages, and we are also dismissing culture. And when we are making language a barrier, it's the equivalent of not building a ramp for the disabled. When we say, okay, I guess if you don't speak fluent English, you're gonna have all these services not be available to you.
Right.
So I think that from a policy level and a programmatic level, this needs to be addressed.
Yeah. And I mean, even beyond healthcare and justice, I've seen it in my own industry, the news media. And I know there's a media panel later on, so perhaps this will be brought up there as well. Our next question is from Lorraine. How do we have more people learn the racialized and Indigenous history of our country? So much of this hate is deja vu. We keep repeating the errors and injustice. So how do we continue the learning or start the learning of racialized and Indigenous history of this country? I'll go to you, Olivia. You're within the education system right now. So what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think education systems play such a pivotal role in giving us the shared knowledge and groundwork to have these conversations about race and learn about the histories of racism. And I think there is a lot of work being done through primary education in elementary school, high school, in universities to start having conversations about these histories. And I think even compared to thinking of when I was in elementary school versus students who are there now, what is incorporated into the curriculum is we've seen quite a drastic shift there. However, I think we need to continue building on that capacity because there are not all of our population is in school, right? Not all the people, school can't be the only way we learn to talk about these issues.
Right.
So there is need to build capacity for that as well, to hold these dialogues within our communities. And it really is, there are organizations out here trying to do that work already. They need resources and funding to do that, right? That is probably the biggest thing. We see community organizations trying to do this work, and so often they are under-resourced and under-supported. So how are they going to be able to provide that kind of free education? Because they're doing such a service to broader society in providing the knowledge and language around these issues, and just really making sure we continue to advocate for resources to support those, that we put our money where our concerns are and make sure that we show that these issues are a priority for both our education systems and then also in our broader community as well.
Okay, Amy, you've got your hand up.
Yes. Recently, I just read online about a Chinese Canadian child going to, I believe it's a childcare, speaking Cantonese, and the childcare worker was very upset that this child will never be able to succeed because he or she is speaking Chinese and not English. So I think the issue of education system really starts with dismantling what is the best for us, what are considered the norm, what are considered better than the others, right? Speaking fluency in English and not being able to converse in your mother tongue, right? Not being able to understand your own history and what is defined as the best performance. All that needs to be dismantled, just like Kenneth has said, in our healthcare system. What is defined as good parenting, right? So I think that has to be the mindset in changing our education system, not only including the curriculum and changing the curriculum to reflect the lived history and the colonization, the impact of that, the racism that we've experienced, for centuries, but also how are the teachers being taught in teachers' education program? How are the schools being managed by teachers of color and racialized background? How are the whole education system? What are the messages are we conveying in terms of citizenship, in terms of responsibility, in terms of accountability, and in terms of collective responsibility. So I think all those need to be questioned. It's not just a matter of having a curriculum, and we know that. We know that having that discussion around anti-Asian racism, it's only a step. There are so many, many other things that we need to do.
We need to look at everything through an anti-racism perspective. Not, as you say, not just what is learned in the classroom, but what is, who's teaching it, how are they teaching it? And not just in schools, as Olivia pointed out too, but it was brought home to me in one of our internal discussions. I'm not sure if my company wants me to talk about our internal discussions, but that we need to look at everything through an anti-racism lens. We are almost out of time. So I know we're going to go over time because I'm going to ask each of you to very quickly give me some sort of closing thought to put you on the spot, but maybe as a jumping off point. Is this it? Are we just going to have this few months of talking about this, or is there actually, as I think one of you said, is this a true opening, a true start? I think it was you, Ellen. Is this a starting point that we will continue with and hopefully not just talk about it, but make change? And I would ask you to keep it brief because there's another panel about to start. So maybe I'll start with you, Ellen.
Sure. I think I would just invite everyone to really ask themselves, like, why are you here? What interests you about this? We saw a huge uptick of interest after the tragedy in Atlanta. If that brought you into this conversation, that's great. But what was preventing you from being here before that? And how do you plan to sustain your support? I think this is the question that we need everyone, Asians, non-Asians, everyone, to be asking themselves. Why are you here, and how do you plan to sustain your support? And that answer is going to look different for everyone.
Thank you, Ellen. Kenneth, closing thoughts?
Yeah, maybe I'll use this opportunity to also answer one of the Slido questions slightly. I think that this is an ongoing journey. Racism has a long, extended history, and I think so it's not going to end overnight. And human beings being human beings, there are both flaws and our tendency to have stereotypes, implicit bias, but also capacity for great compassion and great cooperation. And so I think that there's always hope that we are in this journey together to fight. And I think that instead of being a flavor of the month, what we want to do is continue to build this as a sustained movement towards social justice and equity. And why there's hope is because we have younger and younger folks who are really, really engaged. Look at the panels today. I am one of the youngest one on the panel. So I think that we need to continue to champion young voices. And so I just want to congratulate the young people in this panel, the young people tuning in. We know that the ethnocultural identity development, it's so important for the mental health well-being. And we know some of the stats have shown actually second generation have worse mental health than the first generation because of the increased stress and this identity being undermined. And yet they have tremendous passion and so capacity. And so I think all of us work together across the spectrum, across professions, across sectors, and across the age span that collectively we can move towards a better and more equitable society.
Thank you, Kenneth. You talked about younger people. Olivia, I feel like I'm coming to you next.
Yeah, I had the privilege of being involved with the Student Advisory Council leading up to this event, and I got to meet with a great group of student leaders from across Canada, and just in all the other ways that I've been engaged with students in the lead up to this event, just the energy and the excitement tempered, I will say, by cynicism, because we have been let down by institutions before, but there is real energy around these issues in our younger community members. I'm thinking of all the students who are on our student Discord lounge for this forum right now. I've been getting notifications from them throughout this entire panel. So shout out to all of you and the discussions that are happening there and the discussions that will continue happening throughout this forum. And we're hopeful that the momentum from this will continue and that these conversations will happen in younger communities, but also across the different generations as well. And I know personally, I draw a lot of strength from knowing that people have been engaged in this work for generations, right? While this is definitely a moment for anti-Asian racism in Canada, people have been doing this work for a long time, and there are generations of people who have come before us and will come after us that will continue doing this work.
Thank you, Olivia. And I'll give Amy the final word here. Amy?
Thank you so much. I learned from Indigenous leaders the word humility. And I think it is something that we all need to take to heart, humility, and personally and as organization. The Indigenous rights movement, it has to be grounded in collectively that we approach that with humbleness, humility, and a passion to address. And similarly, racism has to be grounded on that we learn, we know our shortcomings, we reflect on our weaknesses, our shortcomings, we will approach it with humbleness so that every day we enrich our knowledge, we enrich our skills. As well, we apply the passion to combat it in everything we do. You may be interested in environmental movement. You may be interested in other social justice movement. Use that passion, use that understanding of racism and intersectionality of oppression to your work. So I will leave this with two words, humility and passion, to guide not only individuals, but organization.
Thank you very much, Amy. I'll just close this out by saying I do have some hope that this conversation will continue and go beyond just talk. I certainly hope so, but that this is not just a moment in time. It is a moment in time, and this is, we're going to talk about this a lot right now, and it might slow down a little bit, but personally, I have never felt as much passion about this as I do now. And I do personally check in mentally several times a day, thinking about this and how my biases affect how I live my life and how I do my job, and in trying to face those biases, my internal biases, I hope to become better at my job and to live a better life and to live an anti-racist life. So I feel like there is hope, and I feel like we are going to go beyond the flavor of the month. And I thank you so much for being with us here today. To all of our panelists, Kenneth, Amy, Olivia, and Ellen, thank you so much for being part of this important conversation. Hopefully you'll be able to stick around and see the other panels as well. A big thank you to all of you who are watching. I can't see any of you, which is actually better for my nerves, but thank you so much for joining us virtually this morning. The next panel is starting very shortly. My apologies for going over time, but hopefully you'll be able to get to your next session at 10 a.m. Thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you so much.